The air hangs thick with ozone and the ghost of old nicotine, a faint hum from the war surplus transmitter vibrating through the reclaimed substation's concrete floor. Hand-labeled vinyl spins on a borrowed deck, its grooves whispering tales from a world both 1966 and 2036. Dust motes dance in the single neon tube, casting a wound-red glow over dead server racks that stand like forgotten sentinels.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Toronto checks in at 61 degrees and overcast. Airflow is east-southeast at about 8 miles per hour. Somewhere a capacitor creaks under the load. Hot metal. The console keeps its lights and its secrets. First up, the state of Florida's latest declaration. Governor DeSantis touting the deportation of 21,000 individuals as a detention facility, known colloquially as Alligator Alcatraz, closes its gates.
This specific move involves the shuttering of the Everglades Detention Center near Immokalee, impacting roughly 500 current detainees who now face transfer or accelerated removal. This notorious facility, officially the Glades County Detention Center, has been the subject of numerous human rights complaints detailing abysmal conditions, medical neglect, and excessive force. Despite its closure, the reported 21,000 deportations cited by Tallahassee over the past year expose a deeply vulnerable population, primarily asylum seekers and undocumented workers, to immediate displacement and family separation across state lines and into federal pipelines. The facility itself costs state taxpayers a staggering $1.2 million a day to operate, a cost that now shifts but doesn't disappear.
The image conjured is a contemporary trail of tears, where the American dream becomes a mirage in the swamplands. The closing of Alligator Alcatraz feels less like a reform and more like a shell game, a shifting of human misery from one opaque structure to another. We see echoes of past displacements, carving new paths of uncertainty for families who sought refuge, leaving behind a ghost facility in the Glades while the systemic cruelty continues, unaddressed. It's a performance of strength built on the structural erasure of dignity.
Patching in a caller, the skeptic. You're on the signal.
Togee, Elias here. When DeSantis boasts 21,000 deportations, who actually carries the financial weight for this rapid processing and transfer? Is it federal taxpayers, or are local economies losing essential labor? What's the real ledger entry for this efficiency?
Elias, that's the core of the cost-benefit analysis, and one that's rarely transparently presented. While the state claims federal assistance for deportations, the immediate economic impact often falls heavily on the deported individuals who lose wages and their communities who lose essential labor. We're talking about industries like agriculture and hospitality, which depend on these workers, suddenly facing labor shortages and increased operational costs. A viable alternative would be expanding community-based alternatives to detention, like the Freedom Network's supervised release programs, which cost significantly less, an average of $5 per day per person, compared to $150 to $200 for traditional detention.
To put a sharper point on it, studies by the Center for American Progress show that deporting undocumented workers could cost the U.S. economy trillions of dollars in lost GDP over a decade, not to mention the immediate economic disruption to local businesses and families who often rely on these workers' contributions. The $1.2 million a day for Alligator Alcatraz was only part of the equation. The long-term societal cost of these mass deportations is astronomical.
And the boast itself is a political act, a narrative designed to assert a particular kind of power. It's a deflection from the core issue of human dignity, turning individuals into statistics, removing their provenance and erasing their consent from the civic architecture. The structural self-worth of a state should not be measured by how many it expels, but by how it upholds the rights and potential of all within its borders.
Lines open. Patching in a caller. Go ahead.
So beyond the immediate financial hit, what's the long-term architectural signal this sends? Does this focus on expulsion undermine any chance of building a truly resilient, inclusive society in Florida?
Switching frequencies. Next signal. heatwave. A knock on the door makes the... Precisely, Elias. The chosen next move by Tallahassee, despite the closure of one facility, appears to be a continued reliance on federal deportation pipelines, likely increasing pressure on other regional facilities like the Chrome Service Processing Center in Miami. This sends a clear signal that a significant segment of the population is deemed disposable, structurally undermining the principles of consent and dignity. It erodes civic trust and hinders the development of resilient social architectures, favoring short-term political gains over long-term societal cohesion and economic stability. It's a toxic residue that must be discerned from any genuine architectural signal of progress. Same dossier, new angle. Keep the thread tight.
Debrief like designers. Log the friction, script a small rule bend, and try it live.
Brussels intends to host a high-level meeting next month, akin to the Doha talks, with Taliban representatives to discuss critical humanitarian access for the 29 million Afghans currently facing severe food insecurity and to address regional security concerns. This engagement exposes the EU's human rights credibility to significant scrutiny, particularly from Afghan women's rights advocates and international NGOs like Human Rights Watch, who argue it legitimizes an oppressive regime that has systematically erased women from public life, banned girls' education, and executed opponents without due process.
It's a diplomatic dance with a moral tightrope walk. The image is of Europe shaking hands with a regime that has systematically dismantled women's rights and education, draped in the guise of pragmatism. History whispers of such necessary evils, often eroding long-term principles and emboldening authoritarian structures. The EU, a foundational architect of human rights, risks compromising its own structural integrity by granting such a platform, essentially devaluing the provenance of its own values in the name of transactional engagement.
Call us on. Go ahead.
Togee, this is Elias again. Why bring the Taliban to Brussels? What tangible benefit does the EU gain by legitimizing them on European soil? Does this not embolden other oppressive regimes globally, effectively saying human rights are negotiable under the right circumstances?
Elias, the EU's stated aim is to unblock humanitarian aid channels and ensure regional stability, believing direct engagement is the most effective way to address the dire situation on the ground. However, the criticism is sharp precisely because of the potential for perceived legitimation, which could undermine years of advocacy for human rights. A concrete alternative could be conditional engagement through United Nations channels, focusing strictly on specific aid delivery mechanisms and human rights benchmarks, without the symbolic gesture of formal political recognition in a European capital. This would maintain pressure while still facilitating aid.
To integrate logic and emotion here, the logical imperative for aid collides head-on with the emotional, moral outrage of validating a regime built on oppression. The EU's internal compass should be pointing to universal human dignity, yet this move suggests a structural compromise, blurring the lines of what consent truly means in the international arena when negotiating with those who deny it to their own people.
Data from previous engagements like the Doha talks shows a mixed bag. While some aid flows were facilitated, there's little evidence that the Taliban's policies on women's rights or governance have softened due to these diplomatic overtures. In fact, Human Rights Watch reports a further tightening of restrictions on women in recent months. The EU's gamble here is that humanitarian outcomes will outweigh the significant reputational cost and the potential erosion of its own human rights architecture.
We've got someone.
So is this merely turning a blind eye to atrocities for the sake of realpolitik, or is there a strategic argument that this engagement, however distasteful, is genuinely the only way to prevent an even worse humanitarian catastrophe?
It's the latter argument that the EU is making, Elias, but it's a tightrope walk fraught with peril. The current chosen next move, despite the backlash, is to proceed with the talks, betting that direct engagement will yield more immediate humanitarian results for the Afghan people, though at a significant reputational cost to EU values and its long-term architectural signal. The discernment required here is immense, separating the toxic residue of validating a regime from the architectural signal of genuine humanitarian intent. It requires an unwavering internal compass to navigate such compromises without losing sight of foundational principles of dignity and provenance. Our final vector of analysis brings us home to the accelerating climate crisis. The stark warning, a knock on the door makes the difference between life and death during a heatwave.
The phrase "a knock on the door" highlights the fundamental, almost mythic human act of community care against an invisible, escalating threat. It's the difference between a neighbor and a statistic, a stark reminder that our collective architecture is only as strong as its weakest link, depending on the most basic acts of human connection. It speaks to the erosion of the social fabric when individual acts of kindness become the primary defense against a systemic failure. Where is the structural consent to protect everyone?
Lines open. Patching in a caller. Go ahead.
Togee, Elias again. A knock on the door sounds noble, but is that really a systemic solution to 45-degree heat? Who is ultimately responsible for protecting these exposed populations from an accelerating climate crisis? Are cities just relying on volunteers instead of robust infrastructure and planning?
Elias, you're hitting on the core architectural flaw. While volunteer efforts are vital and embody essential human dignity, they are not a substitute for systemic resilience. The ultimate responsibility lies with municipal and national governments to build proactive, climate-adaptive civic architectures. A viable alternative involves comprehensive urban planning, mandating accessible, well-advertised public cooling centers, enforcing heat protection for outdoor workers with mandatory breaks and hydration, and integrating robust public health alerts with automated outreach systems for at-risk individuals.
The myth of self-reliance in the face of a collective threat like a heatwave is a dangerous one. Our inner compass of self-worth is not just individual, it extends to how we value the lives of those around us. When a city fails to protect its most vulnerable from a foreseeable crisis, it speaks to a structural lack of dignity and a failure of collective consent. It's confusing, a desperate symptom for a systemic solution.
Seville itself, to its credit, has launched initiatives like Project Cooler Cities to plant more trees and install water features, but these are long-term solutions. Many municipalities, however, still operate reactively, relying on emergency services and volunteer check-ins as primary responses. The cost of inaction is far greater. The World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, climate change could cause an additional 250,000 deaths per year from heat stress alone. Proactive investment in green infrastructure, resilient power grids, and cooling centers is economically sound and structurally essential.
So, what's the real barrier to shifting from reactive to proactive? Togee. Is it just funding? Or is there a deeper political and social inertia preventing cities from building truly resilient heatwave architectures?
Copy that, bringing it back to the main thread.
Rules bent wisely.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Continue the signal at TogeeVision.com. Tune in, Sparks and Stories, Gig Passport.